Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my driver rankings for the 2024 F1 grid. So these are not predictions for the Drivers' Championship. This is basically ranking drivers as if you put them all in equal cars and what the order of said championship or said race would be. So I did this, of course, last year. Last year it was split across two videos. This year I'll be just doing it in one video. And of course, the only difference from last year's video is that we now have Daniel Ricciardo on the grid, and we no longer have Nick De Vries. So you can argue probably a much stronger grid, than last year, just from that one change. So starting with number 20, staying in the same spot as last year is Logan Sergeant. So for Sergeant, he had a tough rookie season, only scored that 1 point. And I believe finished second last in the Drivers' Championship, only ahead of Nick De Vries. For Sargent, I think qualifying there was a massive gap to Albon. Race pace as well, there was a massive gap to Albon, and those are two things that he's definitely going to want to improve this season if he wants to have any hope of A, sticking around in F1 beyond this season, and B, moving higher up this board beyond 20th spot. Now, number 19, dropping two positions from last year is Zhou Guangyu. So for Zhou, he drops not because I think he got worse this last year, but because I think a bunch of other drivers moved up or came on the grid. So for Zhou, I think his second season was definitely an improvement on his first season. I think that in qualifying, he's kind of plateaued as a driver though. First season and his second season, the gap between himself and Bottas in qualifying was about 2.5 tenths of a second. So I don't think he's the best qualifier. Of course, Bottas still a pretty good qualifier. That being said, in the races, he did massively improve compared to his first season in F1. So that's definitely a good sign. But for me, still, I do think he's one of the weaker drivers on the grid. And he doesn't have, I don't think he has that kind of, those top end performances that you see from young talented drivers that show real sparks, that there's massive potential there. And for Zhou, we haven't really seen that, I feel, across his first two seasons. Next, number 18, dropping 3 positions from last year is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, another year in F1, but that being said, I think one of his most disappointing seasons last year. For Stroll, I think he, of course, missing preseason testing, he didn't have as much experience with the car as Alonso, but that being said, Alonso was effectively coming into his team, and Alonso basically made it his own overnight. For Stroll, I think that the inconsistency that's plagued him for years, I think, became a big problem last year, especially in qualifying when the car got a bit difficult to drive. Alonso was able to drive around those issues where Stroll really hasn't. I really feel with these new regulations, 2022-2023, it's been a bit of a step back compared to, I would say, 2020 and 2021. And yeah, Stroll just hasn't really been able to adapt to them as well as he did the pre-ground effect regulations. We know in qualifying he's not the best qualifier. I would argue he's one of the weakest qualifiers on the grid. Probably 18th in qualifying, I would say. Race pace maybe a little bit higher. And we know that there's a lot of inconsistency there. And he's had, I think the last couple of years he's had a number of big crashes as well. Think of Singapore, where he basically crashed at qualifying and then couldn't participate in the race. And at this point, Stroll's basically known quantity, not a particularly great driver. And I think if his father wasn't the owner of Aston Martin, he wouldn't be in the sport at this moment. And at some point he may get replaced, but this year may be that year. But I'm not sure. Number 17, dropping 4 spots from last year, is Kevin Magnuson. So for Magnuson, I felt he had a pretty disappointing year. 2022, of course, was up against Mick Schumacher. This year came in new teammate Nico Hulkenberg, who had been basically out of a full-time race seat since 2019, so quite a long time by F1 standards. And Magnuson should have had a massive advantage over Hulkenberg. The fact that he's coming into Magnuson's team, the fact that he's quite a bit older, and of course coming into F1 after so long away. I think those should have all been massively beneficial for Magnuson, but that wasn't really the case. Qualifying was a massive struggle for Magnuson, was out-qualified by Hulkenberg. I think by a ratio of about 2-1, and I think by an average gap of about 2.5 to 3 tenths, which is clearly, I think, way too much for a driver of a Hulkenberg's caliber and for a driver of Hulkenberg's age. I know he said in interviews several times that the style of the car didn't really suit his driving style, so that hindered him in qualifying. But that just kind of suggests that that's kind of a lack of adaptability there. For Magnuson, we know he's a decent racer, a decent qualifier, a bit over aggressive at times, but still, I do wonder if his time in F1 may be coming into an end in the coming years. Number 16, I've gone with Yuki Tsunoda, who stays in the same position as last year. So for Tsunoda, stays in the same position. I do think he improved as a driver though this past season. Really solid qualifier, solid racer. I do think that wheel-to-wheel racing he could improve, and that's something that he can definitely work on. I think that's one kind of weakness that he has. I think the consistency really improved last year. He was able to get consistent 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th place finishes that first 6 or 7 races, which in the caliber of car that the AlphaTauri was at the start of last year is quite impressive. So for Tsunoda, I think this is going to be another big year, of course, up against Daniel Ricciardo. Just based on all of the news coming out from Red Bull, when they talk about this, it doesn't really seem like he's in line for that Red Bull seat. I think he would basically have to blow Ricciardo out of the water completely to have any chance of going to Red Bull in 2025. But that being said, never say never. And hopefully for Tsunoda, he really needs to put himself in a position where he becomes a tenable option, a decent option for another team on the grid that may want an upgrade. So number 15, moving down 3 positions from last year, is Nico Hulkenberg. So for Hulkenberg, comeback season I thought was actually really, really strong, but despite that moves down quite a few places. I think in qualifying he did well, but I think at some point age is going to start catching up to him. The race pace was about the same as Magnuson. Magnuson was about the same as Mick Schumacher, so I do think the 3 of them were all pretty close. But that being said, the massive upgrade in qualifying performance, plus the less crashes, I definitely think at this point in time showed that it was probably better for Haas to keep Hulkenberg over Schumacher. That being said, for Hulkenberg, he's winding down his F1 career. He probably only has a couple of years left max, but still really decent driver, really good qualifier, and I think the race pace is still pretty good. Number 14, dropping 5 positions from last year, is Valtteri Bottas. Now, it may seem like a bit of an overreaction after a somewhat weak year, but I think for Bottas, he's really an odd driver, I feel. I think in the bottom 4 teams, he, based on his reputation, based on what he did at Mercedes, he should have been comfortably the best driver out of those bottom 4 teams. But I didn't feel like that was the case last year. And for Bottas, I don't know if it's motivation or if it's just kind of natural decline as he gets older. But I definitely feel like he isn't in that caliber of driver that some of the drivers ahead of him are. Even though they were in different teams, there were drivers ahead of him who drove similar levels of machinery, who I felt were much more impressive last year. And for Bottas, kind of similar to Joe, there weren't a ton of peaks last year, while there weren't a ton of valleys either. Some of those peaks that you still saw in 2022 and when he was at Mercedes haven't really been there weren't really there last year. So I still think good driver. At this point, I think a little bit lower down on my list, which I think just kind of highlights how strong the current F1 grid is. Number 13, dropping 5 positions, is Sergio Perez. So for Perez, coming into 2023, especially at the start of 2023 with such a dominant car, there were many people who were talking about, Perez can challenge for the championship, he can pull Rosberg, and I think if he was a driver who was, top 10 on the grid, I think he would have gotten more than 2 wins. He would have gotten more than a couple pole positions. He would have gotten a lot more podiums, and he would have gotten a lot more consistent. And I think for Perez, he's unfortunately showing that at this point in time in his career, he isn't that level of driver. Last year was very inconsistent. He started off very strong, but as soon as we got to the more traditional European tracks, the ones that are more front limited, he really struggled, and he really struggles to adapt to a Red Bull that doesn't perfectly suit him. And also from the mental side as well, we saw that he kind of crumbled under the pressure in certain races, Mexico, Japan, where he just made mistake after mistake after mistake in that kind of phase of the season. And for Perez, we know he's never been the best qualifier, but last year it was pretty horrific for quite a few races. Had a very long streak of not getting into Q3 in the best car on the grid, which would be frankly unacceptable if it was Bottas or if it was a Massa or if it was a Rubens Barrichello. But for Perez, yeah, it was pretty terrible. And we know he's never been the best qualifier, like I said. So I think just with kind of him getting older, I think it's kind of starting that kind of decline in qualifying performance is definitely starting to show. I think the race pace is still all right. It's still satisfactory for the Red Bull given how good it was last year and how good it's expected to be this year. But like I said, I think it's the trade-off between that and the poor qualifying, I think, is not there. I think the racecraft as well was also quite poor last year, so that's definitely something that I think contributed to him falling this year. Number 12, Alex Albon. So for Albon, he moves up 2 spots compared to last year. Very impressive 2023 season. I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about Bottas, but I felt like Albon was one of the strongest drivers in those bottom 4, and was the strongest driver in those bottom 4 teams. He had races where he performed exceptionally well, great qualifying performances, great performances in the race, and of course the characteristics of that Williams and its very peaky and inconsistent nature from track to track definitely gave him a slight advantage over Bottas in that respect. But I still feel like Albon has last couple of years has matured into a really well-rounded driver, and I think a guy who may be looking for a promotion this summer. Of course, the one caveat with Albon is that his 2 teammates the last 2 years have been Sargent, ranked 20th, and Latifi, who's not on the grid anymore. So you can argue he's had very, very weak teammates, but he hasn't really put a foot wrong. He whitewashed Sargent last year, and he came very close, or he did the same, I believe. I'd have to check, but he was very, very close to doing that to Latifi in the year before. So he hasn't put a foot wrong, and I think he's developed very well. Of course, I would like to see him up against a more kind of a more higher caliber driver than Sargent or Latifi if I want to keep moving him up, but unfortunately we don't really have that opportunity. But still, up 2 spots for Alex Albon. Now, number 11, I've decided to put Daniel Ricciardo. Now, if I had a channel and I made this video 2020 after his great season at Renault, even after any of the Red Bull years, he would probably be top 5, maybe 6th or 7th at lowest. But those 2 years at McLaren definitely put a massive dent on his reputation. And while we did get a small sample size at the tail end of last year, between himself and Tsunoda, it was very, very close on paper and just looking at the stats. But there was such a small sample size, and there were so many races where random things just happened, like Brazil, for example, when a tire landed on Ricciardo's rear wing and he was forced to be a lap down the entire race. So for Ricciardo, I think this is going to be a make or break year for his F1 comeback. He either has to beat Tsunoda, potentially get himself a shot at the main team Red Bull next year, or if things don't go so well, he may be looking at basically a second F1 exit at the end of the year. But for Ricciardo, we know decent qualifier, very good overtaker, and I think very strong in the race pace, very well-rounded driver. And I think there's just kind of question marks right now about where that performance is right now. I think this year will be a really good sign of, do we have the Red Bull, the Renault McLaren back, or the Red Bull or Renault Ricciardo back, or do we have kind of a continuation of the McLaren Ricciardo that got dropped at the end of 2022. So I think a big year to see which of those 2 Ricciardos is the real Ricciardo, I guess. But for now, I'm kind of hedging my bets and putting him in 11th. Number 10, moving up 9 positions from last year, is Oscar Piastri. So of course, when I did my video last year, Piastri had never done a F1 Grand Prix. So of course, I had him ranked in 19th, which I guess was fair given that he had never raced in F1. really impressive rookie season, so much so that I'm willing to put him in my top 10 drivers on this year's grid. Really impressive driver. I think qualifying speed is really impressive. Being that close to Lando Norris in his first year was quite impressive. The race pace, I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there. But the fact that he's so close in qualifying, and even towards the second half of the season, it was almost 50-50. I think there's a lot of room for growth there, and now that he's going to be going back into his second year, he's going to be going to all these tracks that he knows well. He's done a Grand Prix on them. I think that the race pace, the tire wear will be much better. The racecraft was quite good. I don't remember a ton of wheel-to-wheel battles involving Pastri, but I also don't remember a ton of crashes either. Generally pretty clean driver from what I remember. I know he did have that incident in Belgium, but still, that was kind of a 50-50 incident with Sainz. But still, really excited to see what Piastri can do, and if he has another great year, he may progress a couple more spots on my board next year. Number 9, let's see, compared to last year, where is he? Okay, yeah, actually one spot higher than last year is Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, of course, driving for Alpine, pretty good year. I felt for both drivers, I can honestly write them down together. But yeah, actually, let's just do that. So number 8 is Pierre Gasly. Number 9, Esteban Ocon. I'll talk about the two Alpine drivers together. I think both drivers are very, very similar performance-wise. We saw last year how close that points gap was at the end. And even when you look at some of the other underlying stats, like the ones that I've been tracking on my computer, the performance between the two is very, very close. And I do think, if you put them in equal cars, they would be very, very close. I give the slight advantage to Gasly because he did come out ahead on points last year. He did beat Ocon in the championship in his first year at Alpine, which is definitely not the easiest thing to do, coming into someone else's team and beating them right away. I think for this year, I think both drivers will be kind of trying to make a name for themselves, trying to put themselves out there in the driver's market, and hopefully maybe get a promotion to a better seat or a different seat. I think for Gasly and Ocon, they're both good qualifiers. I would say Gasly may be slightly better than Ocon at this point in time, but I think over race distance they're pretty equal, and it's very hard to separate the two of them. And yeah, for both of them, they're kind of at their peak of their career. They're not top level drivers, guys who I haven't mentioned, but they're also not guys who I think have any risk of losing their seat anytime soon. Let's see, number 7. Staying in the same spot as last year is Carlos Sainz. So for Sainz, really strong driver, of course. Very good in the race pace. Qualifying pace, I think, a little bit off Leclerc. But of course, he's also a guy kind of similar to some of the other drivers I mentioned, like Hulkenberg and Magnuson, that he is a little bit susceptible to the characteristics of the car and influencing his performance. So for Sainz, we know that he prefers understeer, Leclerc prefers oversteer, and that's kind of been like an internal battle in Ferrari of which way to develop the car. When the car is understeery, Sainz is very, very close to Leclerc. But when the car is oversteery, that gap grows, and Leclerc's advantage generally grows, like we saw in 2022. I'm not sure what we're going to get this year, but reality is I think Sainz is a very good driver, a little bit above your Gaslys and your Ocons, but I don't think quite a little bit below, a step below the drivers who I haven't mentioned yet. Of course, he's without a contract entering 2024, so that's going to be quite a bit of pressure on him to try to kind of prove himself in that first half. First 2/3 of the season to try to get himself another seat. I'm sure he'll get another seat, but I think it's what kind of seat he gets is definitely still up in the air. Alright, number 6, moving down 2 spots from last year, is George Russell. So for Russell, really impressive 2022. Followed that up with a bit of an off 2024. The qualifying pace was slightly better than 2023. And I don't think anyone has any doubt that Russell is an excellent qualifier, arguably one of the top 5 qualifiers on the grid. But I do think in race pace and wheel-to-wheel racecraft, I do think that there's still a little bit missing, especially compared to his teammate Lewis Hamilton, who of course hasn't showed up yet. For Russell, I do think there's still a little bit of room to grow in those 2 areas. and that's something that he's going to try to have to do in the next couple of years if he wants to kind of posit himself as a guy who could win, who could challenge a Max Verstappen and win world championships. Now, we go into drivers 2, 3, 4, and 5, and those drivers are very, very close. And I've actually kept them all in the same order as last year with slight changes because, of course, Russell, I've dropped Russell a spot. So, going into number 5 is Fernando Alonso, who moves up one spot from last year. Now, for Alonso, excellent driver, and I think last year was kind of a renaissance, a real kind of return to kind of the years at Ferrari, which were, pretty successful, not so super successful, no world championships, but still very successful. Was on the podium 8 times last year, which I think is definitely more than anyone could have hoped for. I think for Alonso, he showed that his race pace, his racecraft is still elite, one of the best drivers on the grid in that respect. The reason I'm holding him back from maybe spots 2, 3, and 4 is I do think that in qualifying, he is losing a little bit relative to some of the drivers ahead of him. The other caveat is that I do feel that his benchmark this year was Stroll, who of course I ranked in 18th. So of course it makes Alonso look basically indomitable, makes it look like he's unbeatable when he's destroying his teammate Stroll week in and week out. The 2 years before when he was at Alpine, of course, I do think he was better than Ocon, but that gap between himself and Ocon was not that big. And of course, ranking Ocon 9th, I don't think Ocon's a world beater himself. So for those reasons, I think just because the gap between, Alonso and Stroll is so big, it's really hard to kind of simply say because of that, Alonso is, the second best driver on the grid, the best driver on the grid. That being said, we did get to see him race with Hamilton, Leclerc's and Norris's, in cars that were roughly equal over the course of the season. And with Alonso being the oldest driver on the grid, there were a couple mistakes last year. I remember Spa when he basically crashed out there, Vegas as well when he spun on the opening lap. And those are unfortunately things that will start to creep in, as he gets older. Still an excellent driver, I must say, but I think, not the Fernando Alonso he was 10, 15 years ago. All right, number 4, moving up one position, is Lando Norris. So for Norris, I think another really strong year in F1. Had an excellent 2022, an excellent 2023, and yeah, I think really just building on his performance the last couple of years. I've been really impressed with his race pace and his racecraft, especially in 2023. Much better than Pastri, and also very competitive with some of the drivers around him, especially at times being better than Hamilton in relatively equal machinery. There were a couple mistakes in qualifying when it looked like he might have been on for a pole position here or there. Like I can imagine, I remember the sprint where Piastri won that sprint where it easily could have been Norris that was in that position. So for Norris, I do think that there's a little bit missing there. I think just in terms of consistency and ironing out small mistakes. But I think a very well-balanced driver in terms of qualifying, race pace, and I do think he's the 4th best driver on this year's grid. Now, number 3, I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc, same position as last year. For Leclerc, I think we know he's probably one of the best, or one of, if not the best, qualifiers on the grid, and that obviously means that he's one of the best drivers on the grid just from that. I think for Leclerc, I think his race pace is a little bit underrated. He's been a bit hampered by the shortcomings of the Ferraris in terms of their tire wear, which makes it look like he's not that good in race pace. But we saw at times in 2022 when Ferrari had a really excellent car in the first third of the season that Leclerc can be very, very good in the races too. I think the one thing with Leclerc though is that it's a bit similar to Norris, but not quite so, is that we know that with Leclerc he does have a habit of sometimes crashing, pushing a bit too hard, whether that be in qualifying like in Miami last year, or whether that be in the race like in Baku 2019 or France in 2022, where sometimes he just pushes a little bit too hard and it kind of all goes wrong. And in a championship challenge against one of the other drivers on the grid, or one of the top 2, that could be proof fatal given the nature of how points are, like the points distribution, where you could be in the lead, crash out, lose 25 points, but every other time you win and the other driver comes second, and it can take you races after race to try to rebuild that drop that you've had just from crashing out that one time. All right, now going into the top two, number 2 staying in the same position is Lewis Hamilton. I think between Hamilton, Leclerc, Norris, and Alonso, it's very, very tight between the 4 of them. And you can honestly make an argument for those 4 drivers, I think, being in any order. Russell, I don't think you can really argue ahead of any of these 4, especially after 2023. But for Hamilton, he honestly had a very, very strong 2023 season. I was very impressed with this season. Qualifying, I think it's starting to go just a little bit. Compared to Russell, the gap between himself in 2022 versus 2023, it was actually bigger in 2023. And I do feel like he's becoming just a little bit less consistent. At his peak in qualifying 2017, 2018, he was consistently getting pole position, 2nd, 3rd places, and he would basically never have an off weekend in qualifying. But last season, I do feel like he had a couple more races where things were just not right, and he would be out in Q2, where Russell was able to qualify top 5. And I think that's something that's just going to kind of increase in frequency as the years go on, as he gets older. But that being said, the race pace is still very strong, and I do think it's his biggest strength as of this point in his career. The racecraft, though, there are some mistakes creeping in, and I think that it kind of gave me pause, and I think I did consider putting Leclerc at number 2 for this year, but I'm like, no. I think both of them have their own issues that make them, I can argue from one way or the other. But for Hamilton, I think just because of his experience, his championship, challenge winning experience, or just like his experience basically being in championship fights, I would put the slight advantage for him over Leclerc. But yeah, like when he took out his teammate in Qatar, or when he had contact with Perez in Belgium last year, those are just 2 instances off the top of my head where he kind of had a bit of a clumsy moment in the races. So that's something to watch out for as well. Now, number 1, I don't think this really was a surprise. I could have written his name down before I even started this video, and that is Max Verstappen. So last 3 or 4 years, I think Verstappen's really cemented himself as the best driver on the Formula 1 grid. I can talk for, hours probably about this, but I'll try to keep it brief given, I think we all know how good he is. For Verstappen, excellent qualifier, probably 2nd best on the grid after Leclerc. I don't think there's a big gap between them, maybe half a tenth, a quarter of a tenth there. But extremely consistent, ruthlessly consistent in qualifying, very few mistakes in qualifying. And I think, even if he has a bad qualifying session, he'll qualify 4th or 5th, and it's usually not, because he crashed into the wall or anything like that. The race pace is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think I've seen anyone I've seen in my time watching F1 has been as consistently good in races, whether it be race starts, whether it's ruthlessness. Wheel to wheel, I think you can make an argument that maybe he's a bit too aggressive at times, but last year or so he basically hasn't really put a foot wrong in that respect. And yeah, I think he's the best driver by a decent margin. I can't remember the last time you could have. I think the last year where you can make an argument about it being tight would be 2021. So basically the last 3 years he's been the best driver. And even then I do think Verstappen was the best driver in 2021. So really you're going back to 2020 when I think it was a real debate between Hamilton and Verstappen for who was the best driver. And at this point I don't really see anyone on the grid except maybe Leclerc or Piastri really ever challenging that anytime soon. It may be a guy who's not even in F1 yet, a guy who's not even in single seaters yet, who kind of takes that from him. So there you go, 28 minutes, almost 29 minutes for my ranking of the 2024 F1 grid. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. I'll be doing plenty more F1 content as the season starts and kicks off this week. Bye-bye.